So as you can see here, this says 属灵无开发为了你的安全请勿进入. So this bit roughly translates to, if you are caught filming here, you will be shot on sight. Just a rough translation. What's up, y'all? So today we are talking about periodization. Now, it's been said that proper periodization prevents plateaus, which I did not just totally make up. But is this true? Now, as always, the answer is a resounding maybe. All right, first of all, what is periodization? And I'll let someone far more experienced and smarter than me just give you the definition.
Overarching definition of periodization. This is not any type. You're probably familiar with the terms linear, block, undulating, so forth, but no type, just a basic definition, and then we'll clarify that a bit. But a basic definition would be the manipulation of training variables to maximize adaptations for a specific time or for a specific performance. And remember, we're going to talk about periodization in the context of powerlifting, of bodybuilding, although it might not be quite as important there, it might look a little different in that context, but maximizing strength and maximizing muscle performance, if you will.
So just to give you guys a little bit of the lay of the land out here in the park, talking about periodization. So let's talk about your program, your progression, and your periodization. So your program, that's just what you're doing in a week. So Monday, obviously, is going to be bench press, and then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday is going to be other stuff. So your program is sort of the most basic layer of the training structure. It's just what you're doing in that week. And then you have your progression. So you have your first week. What do you do week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5? How are you moving from week to actually progressively overload? This could be increasing the sets, it could be the weight, it could be, a variety of ways to actually make progress. And then you have periodization, which is a more phasic type of approach. As the name implies, it is from period to period to period where you're focusing on slightly different things. Now, it's a little bit different from progression where it's sort of baked in. So you can have a linear progression, which is different from linear periodization. So linear progression is just where you are adding weight to the bar every single week. So you have your 5 sets of 5 or 3 sets of 10 or whatever, and you're just trying to add weight every single session. Whereas linear periodization is where the sets and the reps are changing over time, usually going from higher reps and slightly more volume and reducing the reps while increasing the weight over time. And this is usually done by powerlifters who want to peak for a meet at the end. So they go for a more general, slightly higher volume, perhaps more training variety, and as they get closer to their meet, they get more specific in order to peak their strength. Once you get past a certain level, if you're a powerlifter, you cannot be in peak shape all the time. So you have a base phase, maybe a transition phase, then a peak phase, then a taper, and then you try to deliver your best possible performance, probably at a powerlifting meet. You can also have block periodization where it's a little bit more fixed. So you might have a specific block where it is focused on hypertrophy, and then a block where it's focused on power, and then a block where it's more focused on strength, so it's lower reps and heavier weight. This has sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit. It was popular back in the Soviet era. It isn't used as much now. Usually it's a more flowing type of approach where it's more gradual rather than a set in stone period where you are focusing on just one attribute. So, do you need a program? I would say yes. You can't just go into the gym and do something random or do whatever you feel like or do whatever you connect with that day. I don't know anyone, even enhanced lifters, natural lifters, it doesn't matter. I don't know anyone who just doesn't have any program at all. Some people have more flexibility built into their program, but I really don't know anyone who doesn't have any kind of plan whatsoever. And so, yeah, you do need a plan. And so maybe you have your main movements fixed and then your secondary and tertiary movements a little bit more flexible. So it just says, hey, 3 sets of 8 to 10 on a curling variation or something. That's still a plan. It's flexible, but it's still a plan. Now, do you need a progression? Yeah, you do need a progression as well. If you're a beginner, it can be just adding weight to the bar every single session. If you're more advanced, you can use something like a double progression, say 3 sets of 8 to 10. When you get to 3 sets of 10, you add weight, which should drop down your reps, and you just go that way. So you progress in reps, then weight, then reps, then weight, then reps, then weight. Easy. You could also do a triple progression where you have the sets as well that you're modifying, but I would say for most people that's not necessary, and just a double progression is enough. You could also do step loading where you stay with the same weight for a while, and then you bump it up, and then you stay with it for a while, then you bump it up. You could do wave loading where you go up in weight week by week, then you go back down, and then you go up week by week, then you go back down. That can work well. But I would say for most people, if you're just generally interested in hypertrophy, just a double progression is completely fine, or as an evolving rep range, as Natural Hypertrophy says. By the way, his account has been deleted. I might make a full video on that. It depends on if it gets resolved or not. If not, I will be forced to unleash fire. Now, if you are a powerlifter who is serious about powerlifting and strength is your main focus, I would say, yeah, periodization is quite important, and it has been shown in the literature to have a small positive effect. It isn't as big as some people think. Perhaps in the long term it has a bigger effect than the literature shows. The effect size was like 0.23 from what I saw for strength, which is not as big as a lot of people will say it is. And I think it's important not to put periodization on a pedestal. And it's not magic, it's an intelligent way to set things up, but it isn't always automatically going to be way better. Also, if you are a field sport athlete or a sprinter, I think periodization is also fairly obviously going to be beneficial, just because you're working on multiple qualities. And so when you have a specific time that you want to peak...
Let me tell you something. I haven't even begun to peak.
You want to unleash your best performance, it makes sense to train a little bit differently compared to when you're farther away. That is periodization. Okay, it's saying, okay, I want to have a top performance here, therefore I'm going to set this up here, this up here, this up here, in order to build towards that peak performance. So Usain Bolt, the week before his Olympic meet, before the Olympics, he's going to be training differently than a month before. And he's going to be training differently 3 months before, and way differently from 6 months before. And often people take time off, completely off, after the biggest meet. So a lot of powerlifters, the week after their biggest meet of the year, they're not going heavy. In fact, they might not be training at all. However, if you're just a hypertrophy enthusiast, a gym bro, you're not even a bodybuilder, you just like to lift weights and look good, not on one day, but 365 days per year, is periodization necessary? I would say maybe in some cases, but it certainly doesn't have to be the same type of periodization. So for example, take that powerlifter in their off season. They're probably doing more volume, slightly higher reps, slightly lower loading. They're not breaking themselves with 1 rep maxes or even 3 rep maxes. A little bit more variation, more varieties. They might even do like curls, working on the weaknesses, rounding themselves out, that type of thing. They're probably in a caloric surplus. They're looking to gain weight. They're looking to at least gain muscle, that type of thing. That's pretty similar to bodybuilding training. And if you're a hypertrophy enthusiast, that's kind of what you're going to be doing all the time. And if you are purely interested in looking good and building muscle, you don't ever have to peak your strength. I would say to a certain extent, that peak phase is kind of just a waste of time if you're only interested in hypertrophy.
Recovery session or day is trying to really push intensity, like strength. Why? Like your muscles don't so much care that you hit a PR in hack squats, whatever the range was. Like, oh, that's my best ever set of 15. Yeah, but you took a recovery session to do it. Like, yeah, so, well, you could have just taken another overloading session and also grown muscle in that workout. So hypertrophy is much more about hammering it in than it is about creating the conditions to really have a good performance and then backing off, which is much more typical of strength and very typical of peaking. So sort of TLDR, if someone has a hypertrophy plan and they have a ton of recovery work, it doesn't seem like it adds up a whole lot.
Now, if you have goals of both strength and size, I would say, yeah, taking a more phasic and periodized approach makes more sense. And that ratio of base to peak, or how often you are peaking, sort of depends on which goal is more of a priority. So the more strength matters to you, the shorter that base phase and the more focused you're going to be on really driving up those 1 rep max numbers. It's not going to be a huge difference, but you should really assess your goals and think, okay, what is actually important to me? And I do have strength goals, but it's going to be something that I want to build towards always being able to hit, not just peaking to try to hit a certain number once. Now, there are a few arguments in favor of periodization if you're purely interested in hypertrophy. The first would be specialization. So if you want to bring up your calves, your quads, or your biceps, or your back, or whatever, you can run a specialization phase. But I would say you can just bake this into your program. So over the next 8 or 10 weeks, or however long you're writing this program for, you can just say, okay, well, I'm going to be doing a little bit more volume for my back. And that's what I've been doing over the past 6 to 7 months or so. I've had various phases where I've been focusing on the back or then the arms, and you really do have to take a more surgical approach when you're more advanced, because you can't specialize in everything at the same time. If you're a beginner, you don't have to worry really about specialization. In the vast majority of cases, you can just grow everything because everything is a weak point. But as you become more advanced, you need a little bit more volume to grow, or you become stronger and therefore you're able to generate more fatigue, and you just might not be able to grow everything at once. So you have, a specialization phase for back, and the other areas are on maintenance. And you can still specialize in a few areas at once, as long as they're not as conflicting. But you can really map out a training year and have specialization phases. Again, this is a little bit more advanced, and I would say even if you're intermediate, this is not really needed. Now, what about swapping exercises in and out? I would say this is based on your personality as well as physiology. So it's as much psychological as anything else. Some people, especially if you're more advanced, are going to want to swap in and out exercises a little bit more often. Especially if you're not a power lifter, you don't necessarily need to be as specific as someone who is trying to just optimize 3 competition lifts. And you can do this conjugate style where you have a few different lifts that you are rotating in sort of a circle week by week, maxing out on, with bands and then with chains and then with switching up your grip and then your stance, etc. And that can be a good way to keep you healthy, especially as you get more advanced. The more of a beginner you are, the less necessary this is. A beginner, you're not going to have the same speed of learning the movement, and therefore you're better off just sticking to one movement and getting better at that movement and progressing, compared to swapping it on a very regular basis. Once you're more advanced, that becomes not only more viable, but perhaps necessary in some cases. But it's hard to argue that this is really periodization, because it's not a phasic approach, especially if you're not competing or you're not trying to peak on a specific day. It's just sort of the process of training, and you're not focusing on a specific physiological trait at any given movement. You're always focusing on maxing out all the time, every week of the year. There's also the concept of a concurrent approach. So instead of a block periodization model, what's like strength, speed, size, you're only focusing on one attribute and nothing else. A concurrent approach is where you can focus on 2 or 3 or even more traits at the same time. And I would say this is not only viable, but it's going to be a lot better for the average person. So you can focus on a variety of rep ranges at the same exact time. And you can even do it year round. Especially if you don't have any aspirations of competing and peaking on a single day, I would say for most people, this is the way to go. And this is how I do things. I'm doing a variety of reps, a variety of exercises all the time.
They've done studies, 60% of the time, it works every time.
That doesn't make sense.
And I think there's 2 main reasons why periodization is not as needed for just pure hypertrophy training. The first is that muscle sticks around. So strength is a skill, and it's one that devolves somewhat rapidly, especially something like weightlifting in the Olympics. Olympic weightlifting, or just weightlifting, that skill degrades very rapidly. And so you do have to have this periodized approach for peaking on a single day. But muscle, it's not something you lose very quickly once you have it. Second, it's a very general adaptation. It's something that you can achieve through a wide variety of methods. Some people train once per week. Others train 2, 3, 4 times per week, 5 times per week, and they can all build muscle. Huge variety of exercises can build muscle. Rep ranges, loading, huge variety. So hypertrophy training is very, very forgiving, and it sticks around and doesn't require very much maintenance. So a powerlifter doing a 1 rep max squat, that is incredibly specific, and especially when you are very advanced or elite or hyper elite, that's not something you can really maintain and sustain year round. Hence, you have your base and your peak phase. And a lot of beginners don't really realize this because they are always the strongest they've ever been. Even for a lot of intermediates, they can't really wrap their heads around the fact that you won't always be at your strongest when you are advanced. It takes a lot to build it, then transition, then to peak, then to taper, and then to show your best performance. Whereas if you're an intermediate, and especially if you're a beginner, you're always at your best. God damn it, this dude started shoveling dirt. As I'm trying to film. For example, if a powerlifter says, hey, I'm not at my best, my squat is like 50 or 100 pounds below my peak, you'd be like, yeah, sure, that makes sense. If a bodybuilder was like, yeah, I'm not at my best, and they're like 10 or 15 pounds of muscle below their peak, you'd be like, well, that's weird. Unless, of course, they were on anabolics, in which case you'd be like, oh, he's just off cycle, right? Like, he'll gain another 40, 50 pounds of muscle into the Olympia. So I would say if you're natural, you don't have to take a very phasic approach to your training, whereas a lot of these enhanced IFBB Pro plans, they have a very phasic approach, especially to their volume, because that is going to coincide with their anabolic usage. But if you're natural, you don't really need these wild fluctuations in your training. You can keep it pretty much the same year round. Now, what about deloading? Well, I would say if you are interested in strength, there's a much stronger case for deloading, just because fatigue management is going to be much more important. Plus, again, you have this peak and then this deload after, and you might have periodic deloads in your training built in or perhaps auto-regulated in order to dissipate fatigue and ensure progression in load. But if you are purely interested in hypertrophy, I would say there's a much less strong of an argument for having deloads. Natural hypertrophy, he said he never deloads. I've deloaded once in my life intentionally, where it's like, oh, I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna just fuck around with the weights. I've done that once, and it was because I messed up my training. I cooked my training. I trained much too hard for 2 or 3 weeks in a row, and I felt it. But that's probably not optimal. It would have been better just to not mess up my training before and have a more consistent approach. And I had to leave that bench because those workers were loud as shit. Asians love gambling. So when I hear someone deloading every 3 weeks or even every 4 weeks, heck, even every 5 or 6 weeks, my thought is not like, yeah, that's optimal, like you're training so hard you need to deload. My reaction is like either your recovery sucks or like you just can't endure any kind of fatigue, which is normal. Like fatigue is a normal part of training. You're not going to feel 100% all the time, or you are just training way too hard, right? And you mean to tell me like you wouldn't grow from a 12-week training block? And there aren't many people who need to train super, super hard for 5 weeks and then take a week off or take a week of deloading. Why can you not train slightly less hard and then just keep that going throughout the year? Like, what is actually stopping you from doing that? Are you not going to grow from training slightly less hard but training more and not having to deload? Doesn't really make any sense. And I much prefer having a kind of deload Menno Henselman style, where if something hurts or if something is excessively fatigued, you deload that area. So, if your lower back needs a deload, you take a deload, but it doesn't mean you deload you know, your bench press or your elbows or something else. You can also potentially just avoid the deload entirely if you auto-regulate your volume and your effort and your intensity. This takes a little bit more thought than just planning a down week on everything every 6 weeks or something. But if you feel like you need to do a little bit less volume, you know, give yourself 2 to 3 sets or 2 to 4 sets or 3 to 5 sets or whatever, so that you can do the lower side of the volume if you need. And I do take a couple of weeks off, like 1 to 2 weeks off, 1 to 2 times per year. And this is something that I know in advance and I can plan around, but it's certainly not something that is 100% needed. And if you want to train 52 weeks a year, that is completely viable. You just have to keep that in mind and keep a more consistent, even keel with your volume, your intensity, your effort, etc. Also keep in mind that often life will just throw you days off or times where you can't train as hard or as often as you want, and so it is not as needed to periodize things. For strength or for, you know, sports performance, periodization, very, very important and relevant. For just pure casual hypertrophy, not as needed. And I would say for most people, it's a solution looking for a problem, not the other way around. You're probably better off keeping your training relatively simple rather than setting something up that is very, very structured and periodized and inflexible. You're almost certainly better off just auto-regulating and seeing how things go week by week. Come on, bro, come on. Man, the nerve of some people doing their job when a YouTuber is trying to film. God. Now, what about linear periodization? Is there value in changing your rep range over time for hypertrophy? So again, a powerlifter might go from sets of 12 to 10 to 8 to 6s to 5s to 4s all the way up to maybe some singles, then peak, etc. Is that necessary or beneficial for someone just interested in hypertrophy? Probably not. Like your sets of 5 and your sets of 10 and your sets of 15, they're all building hypertrophy fairly equally. And even if you make the argument, oh, they're going to be working different fibers, that doesn't really hold up either. You might be able to make the argument for sarco versus myofibrillar hypertrophy, but even that doesn't have a ton of evidence behind it, and I don't think it would be a huge difference. Plus, you could just do daily undulating periodization. So on one day you're doing sets of 10 to 12, the other you're doing sets of 4 to 6. Boom, best of both worlds. In some ways, I would say DUP is kind of a misnomer, because it's not really periodization. You're doing 2 different things at the same time, but that's not really doing things physically, it's just normal training. Now, what about changes in volume? A lot of the Soviet structures, they had big changes in volume. So there would be a week where it went super high, or a training phase where it went super high, then super low to recover, then like moderate, then high, then like, it was sort of all over the place. And I guess the idea is that you stimulate adaptations and then you back off to try to recover. I have tried this and I always found that it just didn't work as well as advertised. I remember doing a Charles Poliquin program where it was like you do twice a day training for 2 weeks, you just train your ass off like a maniac, and I did. And then you're supposed to take a week off completely, and then when you come back, like you're the Hulk now and you've gained 10 pounds of muscle or something, and it didn't work. It just, nothing happened. Like my strength levels, they dipped a little bit. They were supposed to go down like 20%. Even though I trained my ass off, they went down a little bit, and then they didn't really get a huge rebound. Like, I think people know by now that I train pretty damn hard and can push myself, so it just didn't work the same way for a natural athlete. Now I know that, you know, a lot of this stuff is drug related, but at the time I was like, what's going wrong? So sometimes it's not you, it's the program. Now, what about increases in volume week to week? I would say it kind of makes sense to a certain extent. So maybe you start a training cycle on the lower side because you're not as adapted to those exercises, and then you can add sets over time, but probably not a ton. Don't confuse the ability to recover with the ability to grow. Those are 2 wildly different things. And just because you are returning to baseline, that doesn't mean you can just always chuck in more volume. I know I did that volume on a video on ultra high volume training, but it's just not going to be needed for most people. And I would say if you have the choice between adding a set and progressing in load, go for the load every single time. Oh, that sounds dirty. Oh, God damn it.
So some of the fundamental assumptions we make is that, hey, if you can do more sets and recover from them, you're only going to benefit from those sets. And I think that underlying premise is actually something we need to question, because that would only be true if doing more sets was equivalent to hypertrophy. But your ability to put weight on the bar or do more sets or do more volume is related to hypertrophy, but it is not hypertrophy. And indeed, you can get really good at recovering from one week to the next. Increasing your recovery capacities is not synonymous with increasing your ability to grow. In fact, there's no reason to think they should be. That is just an assumption. We don't have any data on that. What evidence do we have that we need to increase the number of sets after they've been initially established? And the answer is none. We actually don't have any peer-reviewed data that would suggest that we actually need to increase our number of sets over time. Now, I'm not going to sit here and go, evidence of absence is absence of evidence. It's the same thing, you know. I do actually think you will probably need to increase your sets over time, but it totally depends on where you start and what your individual needs are. It is not just a thing you must do, and that if you're not progressing sets within a mesocycle or even a macrocycle, you're doing it wrong or you're doing it suboptimally. If we are in a state of believing that volume is the most important thing for hypertrophy, we almost necessarily devalue things like proximity to failure, intentionality, form, focus while training, and making sure that the quote-unquote quality of training is high. And while no one has ever said, volume's the most important thing, and all the other stuff doesn't matter, unfortunately, that's kind of the way our default setting as humans is. If not A, then B. And it's actually like, hey, take care of A, and we need to do a certain amount of B, and maybe B needs to go up over time if B is volume in this example. So when people are really, really focused on adding sets, like, you know, if the main thing you're thinking about when you write your program is I need to go from 10 to 12 to 14 to 16 to 18 to 20 sets, each one of those sets is serving the purpose of being that number of 10 to 20. It's not necessarily you present, making every rep count, taking those sets to an appropriate proximity to failure that fits in with your programming paradigm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is one thing I've experienced personally, and I've seen in athletes, is that when they have a volume-focused paradigm, where that is what they see as the principal thing that's doing the work for them, that's what's making them grow, rather than just quantifying the total amount of work, they start to let the quality of work slip. And it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where, if you're doing a lot of low-quality volume and your proximity to failure is so high, when you go to this new high-volume program, you actually make progress, you know, because you're wasting a lot of time. You weren't doing a whole lot.
Go, failure set.
For example, this clip is Brad Schoenfeld, who has come out with a lot of research supporting super high-volume training. And this is the set, the working set, the failure set. He's on camera, he's training with John Meadows, and this is the set, the working set. And you can kind of see why you need a lot of volume to grow if you train like this. Now, what about proximity to failure, RR, reps in reserve, etc.? Do you need to set this up in a periodized fashion? Well, the general advice is like start a mesocycle, a training cycle, quite far away from failure, and then go closer to failure as you go through the mesocycle. What happens if you don't, though? What happens if you start training to failure on your isolation movements from day one of the training cycle and you just keep that throughout? Can you suddenly not make progress? Why would you be making better progress? Is it because you have less fatigue? Why are we so concerned about fatigue? For most people, I would say this is absolutely not the limiting factor. I've trained to failure on something literally every single week that I have ever trained. Every week. Now for strength, I think there's an argument for managing your fatigue better, keeping it lower, having deloads, keeping more reps in reserve, etc. Shout out to the data-driven strength guys. They're doing really good work with that. What's up, guys? Editor Jeff here, and I wanted to chuck in this clip by Greg Nuckols of Stronger by Science because I really resonated with it a lot. And I train to failure on something pretty much every week of training. On something. Not necessarily squat or bench or deadlift or these other compound movements, but, you know, it might be a press, it might be a rear delt raise, it might be a leg extension, a leg curl. And I would even say as far as every day in the gym. If I'm in the gym, I'm going to be failing on something. And I mean true failure where I actually fail the rep, not just technical failure, not just like, ooh, that burns failure, but actual failure on something every single session in the gym. Okay? Again, it might be an isolation, it might be a machine. Often it's like 5-10 sets to failure or more. So the idea that you can't adapt to failure, I think, is wrong.
Trying to think like, okay, what is the perfect submaximal amount of effort to exert to minimize the fatigue accumulated in this set, but maximize the hypertrophic adaptation in this set? I don't know. Some people maybe are into that. I'm fucking not. But when you train to failure, you're causing more fatigue, you're taking longer to recover, and you're not really getting anything in return. That constitutes a strong reason to not go to failure in training and to advocate against really ever training to failure. But I don't go that far. And some of the findings from this study and, prior to the study being published, just my own experience constituted reasons why I don't necessarily buy that argument. If people can acclimate to 5 sets of 15 of maximal eccentric reps, I think people can fucking acclimate to training to failure. I think eventually your body just adapts to it. You acclimate. It no longer causes that much additional muscle damage or fatigue, and it's fine. So I could just be kind of playing into my own confirmation biases here because, brother, you're never going to get me to estimate reps in reserve on a set of rear delt flies. I'm never going to do it.
Yeah.
Like, that's always going to failure. And, if I'm wrong, if that's suboptimal, I don't fucking care because I am never going to tell you my RPE for a set of delt raises. It's always 10. It's only ever going to be 10. I'm not going to stop that shy of failure, and you can't make me.
So when people say, failure is really fatiguing, maybe for you, maybe if you haven't done it, but we can adapt to a remarkable amount of stress. And on a lot of movements, failure just isn't that stressful in the first place. So the idea, you have to start a mesocycle 4 or 5 reps away from failure, and then, I only hit failure in the last week because I don't want to get too much fatigue. I think that's bullshit, to be honest. I think it can work, obviously, but the idea that anything else is suboptimal is simply wrong. So if you got a bunch of 23, 24, 25 plus FFMI natural lifters in a room, and then as a beginner you're like, hey guys, should I train 4, 5, 6 reps away from failure? Is that going to be really good? I really don't think many guys would be like, oh yeah, go for it, dude, like that'll be effective. Probably not. And you have some research coming out that says, hey, like, train a bunch of reps away from failure for size, it still works. I'm pretty sure that was on untrained lifters, and if you look at how people actually train, it's not that. This can be exercise dependent as well, so there's a strong case for never failing a squat or a deadlift if you're interested in hypertrophy. But on something like a row, like a chest supported row or a lateral raise, when people are like 3, 4, 5 reps away from failure on those, especially if they're using strict form, I really, really have a hard time believing that you're getting a lot out of that. And so if you're just an average hypertrophy enthusiast, you can keep volume relatively the same. You can keep proximity to failure relatively the same. You can swap in and out exercises as you see fit when you feel that they get stale and you want to do something else. And your training doesn't have to really change drastically over time. You don't have to deload very often. Life will probably throw you a deload when life wants to do that. And I really don't think taking a super structured approach is the best way forward. Shifting a lot of that periodization type of stuff to your progression and to auto-regulation is probably the way to go. And again, this is for casual hypertrophy enthusiasts. If you have both strength and size goals, or you are, thanks buddy. Or if you're a straight up powerlifter, obviously taking a more structured approach is more important because you are likely going to have specific numbers that you want to hit. Also keep in mind that the general consensus on periodization has kind of changed over the past 5 to 10 years pretty significantly. And the idea that we figured everything out in the Soviet era is just wrong. When someone's like, we haven't learned anything new about training in the past 50 years, maybe you haven't, but the rest of the world certainly has. And a lot of coaches are taking a more auto-regulated approach where it's not as structured and there's a little bit more flexibility in the plan. And that's for power lifters, the best in the world. So if you're just interested in hypertrophy, you don't really need to take an ultra rigid fixed approach where you're hitting specific numbers every single week. All right, that is all for this video. Kind of a long one. Let me know if you enjoyed or at least tolerated this style of video. I guess you did if you made it this far. Thank you so much. Definitely grab a copy of my book if you're interested in more training stuff. And I will see you in the next video. Peace.